Sony FX30 versus Sony A7IV for video shooting. Which one to pick? We've tested the hell out of these two cameras, so this video is about to get nerdy. Get ready! As a disclaimer, guys, I have to say that we shot on both identical lenses, 35mm FE f1.8, and the approximate aperture throughout all of the test was f6.3, and because of it we should have no sharpness difference whatsoever in terms of lenses. And also, guys, I've uploaded this video without YouTube's compression in full resolution to a cloud, so you can download it and watch it again later. Let me remind you guys that Sony FX30 has a crop in 4K 100 and 120 frames per second. It's about 1.6 times crop. So here is the difference between the full sensor mode of the FX30 and the 4K 100 and 120 frames per second crop. So guys, let's start off with the sharpness test. Sony A7IV is in full frame mode. Also in the lower part of the image you can read all of the settings, and the spider checker text is magnified by 5 times. So in 4K 25 frames per second I can say that those two images look very much similar. We've set the focus manually, of course, for both of those, and we used Atomos Ninja 5/3 magnifying tool to be sure that they are both in focus. And to my eye, FX30 looks a touch sharper, but it looks like digital sharpening that you can apply with the sharpen effect in Final Cut Pro 10, for instance. So let me say these are very similar results and you won't notice any difference whatsoever in the real life. And now let's switch A7IV to Super35 mode. It has 1.5x crop, and as you can see, guys, the sharpness is also pretty much similar, but I would say it's a bit softer than on the full frame mode, and I can definitely say that the FX30 is winning in this particular category. Now let's switch to 4K 50, and it has a Super35 crop on Sony A7IV as an obligatory option, so you cannot shoot full frame in 4K 50. And as you can see, guys, the FX30 in 4K 50 looks also a touch more sharp, but it's not a huge difference by any means. So now, guys, let's have a look at 4K 100 frames per second on the FX30 versus 4K 25 frames per second. So in 4K 100, as I said before, we have 1.62x crop, and as you can see, guys, the image is a bit softer and much more noisy in the shadows. But still, in terms of resolution, it's more than fine for me. Now let's talk about shooting in 1080p, and here is the screenshot from my previous video comparison, A7IV versus A7S III and A7 III, and as you can see, the A7S III has outstanding 1080p performance and A7 IV is kinda so-so. And here's the full frame mode in A7IV, 1080p 25 frames per second, and let me say, guys, that these two pictures look almost identical. I don't see a dramatic difference between those two. But when we switch to Super35 mode in A7IV, here is the difference. It's getting much sharper and better, in my opinion. So if you want to shoot in 1080p, I would suggest switching to Super35 mode on Sony A7IV. And guys, here is a little chart I made so you can precisely look at all of the resolutions, 500% scales, and kind of pause the video and check for yourself. And now, guys, let's compare S-Log3 S-Cinetone Sony in terms of noise, performance, and color between those two cameras. And this log footage is exposed to the right at plus 1.7 EV, so it's a correct exposure for S-Log3 in terms of best noise performance, because we kind of hide the noise in the shadows and get as much light as possible. And in FX30 we even have a separate mode like Cine EI for shooting in S-Log3, so it's kind of a main picture profile for your camera. So guys, let's start off with the full frame mode on Sony A7IV. You can read the settings down below, and the ISO value is on top. And also here we have a 400% crop from the data colors of the color checker, and also this kind of black square, which is actually from this part of the image, so the darkest shadows of the shot. So now, guys, let's have a look at the skin tone. We had exactly the same lenses and exactly the same settings, so here it is. As you can see, FX30 tends to have a little bit more red in the skin. It's kind of more red and magenta, let me say, and the A7IV looks a bit more green and flat, in my opinion. So I do prefer the skin tone of the FX30. It looks more natural. But still, guys, it's 10-bit 422, and you can definitely dial in any color and settings that you want. And of course, we use the base, the native ISO of 800 in S-Log3. And now, guys, let's have a look at different ISO values of those two cameras. So basically, we have very clean image in 1250 ISO, but the shadows are a bit noisier on the FX30. 1600 ISO looks decent and pretty much usable on both cameras, but still keep in mind that the darkest shadows of the FX30, they will have kind of a filmic looking grain in it. But I like the grain itself, it's kind of cinematic and not too distracting. And here are two native ISOs of FX30, 800 and 2500, and let me say that 2500 is much more noisy than the 800, keeping that in mind guys. 3200 ISO is the second native ISO for Sony A7IV, and we do get very clean image at 3200 in full frame mode. Starting from 4000 ISO, we start to see a little bit of noise with the A7IV, and the FX30 is getting much noisier, but still, the full image, the skin tone, the shirt that my friend wears, they do have kind of pretty good results and not that much noise. The noise is hidden in the shadows. 6400, pretty much usable on both cameras. And also guys, pay the attention that the t-shirt itself has also a bit different color, different colors of blue, let me say. So the color science is a bit different in the FX30. ISO 10,000 and 12,800 is also looking pretty much usable in my opinion, even in the FX30. I would definitely go ahead and shoot in 12,800 ISO if I expose correctly at plus 1.7 EV. 16,000 ISO and 20,000 ISO also look pretty much clean on Sony A7IV, and on Sony FX30 it can be used if you denoise the picture a little bit afterwards in post. 32,000 ISO is the maximum ISO in S-Log3 that you can set on Sony FX30, and if you expose correctly, even the 32,000 ISO is usable if you do some post work with the FX30, so it's a good result. A7IV has a bit more room for the high ISOs, and let's have a look at those values. ISO 40,000 is looking almost okay, very fine noise, and it's more or less usable as well. And also the 51,200, pretty much usable if you denoise it in post a little bit. And also we have some extended range ISOs, but I won't test those, they're pretty much bad, because I know this as a result of my previous test from my previous video. And now guys, let's have a look at Super 35 mode, so 1.5x crop on Sony A7IV. And as you can see guys, at 800 ISO, the base ISO, we have more than comparable images. So not a lot of noise, only the extreme shadows are showing just a tiny bit of noisy shadows, noisy areas, but still it's more than usable. 1600 ISO looks good enough. And then let's switch to the second native ISO for Sony FX30, 2500, and it's okay. Not the best, not as clean as 800, but still more than usable, even in the shadows, guys, don't forget about it. And then 3200 ISO is the second native ISO for A7IV, and it's very clean and usable. 6400 ISO and 12800 ISO are also usable, guys. Don't be afraid to use those ISO values. If you expose correctly, you'll get very decent images. But I want to point out that the FX30 has more small grain, it's more fine, whereas A7IV has more blocky grain, has some noise reduction in camera, and it looks more blocky. ISO 25600 looks normal on both cameras. A7IV is still good, and 32,000 ISO is a maximum ISO in S-Log3 on FX30 and still looks more than good in my opinion. For an APS-C camera, it's a good result, guys. And then let's have a look at highest ISOs on the A7IV. It's also looking decent in my opinion. We have some color shift, just a little bit, but still it's looking good. And now let's have a look at the high ISO performance in 4K 100 frames per second on FX30 with 1.6x crop. At ISO 800 we already see pretty noisy shadows, so please guys, light your scenes properly and expose correctly as I show you in my previous videos. ISO 1000, good, but still it's much more noisy because of this very big crop. The second native ISO of 2500 looks also very noisy, so if you want to shoot in 4K 100 frames per second, I suggest to stay at 800 ISO, and 3200 is probably the biggest ISO value that I would suggest using if you extremely need this. ISO 6400 looks decent if you work with it in post with a denoiser, but let me say 12800 is close to being unusable. And just out of curiosity, I'll show you the other values until 32,000 ISOs in 4K 100 frames per second on FX30. And now guys, let's have a look at one more very popular picture profile, S-Cinetone color, S-Cinetone gamma. You can see the settings in the lower part of the image, and the base ISO in S-Cinetone is 125 on both cameras. In terms of color, we have very similar performance. FX30 has more red and magenta colors in it. ISO 160 looks very clean till the second native ISO. Both cameras show good performance, and let me remind you guys that full frame mode is on A7IV, so we're in full frame, and as you can see, it's pretty clean. Only the shadows on FX30 has some noise, but it's still very fine and not distracting. Now let's switch to 6400 ISO, and it's getting pretty much noisy on both cameras, and 12800 is not that usable on both cameras. We have a very harsh noise reduction in camera noise reduction, and 25600 is not usable in my opinion on both cameras. It's too soft and too noisy, especially on the FX30. Now let's have a look at HLG3 BT.2020. Also, the settings are written down below, but I don't like the HLG color on both cameras. To be honest, the colors are too saturated, and I would prefer shooting S-Log3 for the best results. And also guys, I do think that HLG is not the best performer in terms of high ISOs. The camera turns on the internal noise reduction too early, and also you can see that the noise is very saturated and very pronounced in this picture profile because it has more saturation and more contrast in this picture profile. And let me say the highest ISO I would use is 6400 on the FX30 and 12800 on the A7IV, applying the noise reduction, and after that we see the huge degradation in color and sharpness on both cameras. And here are those three picture profiles on Sony FX30 on base ISOs, and as you can see, the S-Cinetone looks good, S-Log3 also, we have to work with it a little bit to make it look even better, and the HLG is looking not that cool in my opinion. And here they are at 32,000 ISO, and as you can see guys, the S-Log3, when it's exposed correctly, is the best low light picture profile of this camera. And when I say exposed correctly, I have a full video guide on how to expose S-Log3, link in the description below, and it makes a huge difference guys. So after watching this video, please go there and please check this video. And now guys, let's make a test with the cap on. So we have only the shadows, only the blacks on the picture, and I've raised in post the highlights by 100%. So you can more clearly see the shadows. And we're shooting of course in S-Log3. I can straight away see some magenta color in the noise of FX30, and the A7IV looks very clean. And the second native ISO of FX30 is still pretty much noisy, and the second native ISO of A7IV is very clean. ISO 12800 looks very noisy on FX30, and I would say that the best performance we get until 12800, and after 20,000 ISO we also do get this magenta color shift on the A7IV. And all in all, I can say that the FX30 has more fine noise. It looks like a grain from a film, and the A7IV applies a lot of digital noise reduction, and we have a lot of blocks of this digital noise reduction. And now let's switch to Super35 mode, 1.5x crop on the Sony A7IV, and compare those two. I can once again see the magenta color shift on FX30 since ISO 1600, and the second native ISO on the A7IV looks very good. But still guys, those are very comparable. Still the FX30 has more fine noise and more visible noise, and the A7IV gets one more magenta tint from ISO 12800, let me say. And now guys, let's have a look at dynamic range. Here is A7IV in full frame mode, S-Log3 Sony base ISO at 800, and if we grade the image we can see that it's very clean and we have a lot of usable space. We have a very dark corner at the left, and we can raise the exposure to see what's in this corner, and we can lower the exposure to expose properly the little light that is standing on the right in the lower part of the image. FX30 has almost the same dynamic range. Some people say that it's one stop less than the A7S III, for instance, but guys, I don't see a real difference between those two cameras in dynamic range. We have about 12 stops of usable dynamic range on both cameras. And we can do the same thing with the FX30. We can raise up the shadows and see what's in there. It has some more noise, of course, and we can lower the exposure to expose correctly for this little light. And if we kind of cut between those two cameras without even grading those, we can see that it's almost identical. I don't see a real difference. Maybe it's like 1 or 2%, but all in all, it's more than comparable. So don't be afraid to use FX30. In terms of dynamic range, it's a good performer. Warning guys, rolling shutter test. So FX30 with a 50mm lens or 75mm full frame equivalent in 4K 25 frames per second has pretty strong rolling shutter effect. It's much more visible than on the Sony A7IV, for instance, or FX3. And please guys, be careful with moving your camera. It's better than on the APS-C cameras like A6300, but still it's more than visible. And when we switch to 4K 100 frames per second, we get 1:1 readout, so less image processing, and the rolling shutter performance improves dramatically. Now let's have a look at Sony A7IV in full frame equivalent, 75mm lens, and it has even more rolling shutter than the FX30. It's close, but still it's a bit more than on the FX30. So in full frame mode, it's very noticeable, and you have to be very careful with moving your camera. But when we switch to Super35 mode on the 50mm lens, so it's an equivalent of a 75mm lens, we see that it improves, but not by a huge margin. So still, rolling shutter is a weak performer on the A7IV, and here is the stop frame. Yeah, it's more or less comparable, but still guys, I would rather prefer using A7S III or an FX3 in terms of rolling shutter. And now let's compare the IBIS performance. We have this little rig up here, so they're basically combined together in a pretty strong way. And as you can see guys, in steady shot standard, in Super35 mode on A7IV, we have more or less the same performance. It's not the best performance in my opinion, so I would rather use steady shot active, and both cameras also have the metadata and gyroscopic data. You can use it with Catalyst Browse. In Super35 mode, steady shot active looks also kind of the same on the A7IV as on the Sony FX30, and it's a good performance here. I would say FX30 is even a little bit less stable. But in full frame mode in Sony A7IV with a 50mm lens, we see that it has worse performance than with the Sony FX30 and the 35mm lens. So if you shoot full frame, you'd better use a gimbal with the A7IV or a monopod or a tripod. The autofocus in latest Sony cameras is simply remarkable, and I found that it works identical, so it's not even worth your attention guys. It's reliable and fast and sticky. No worries here. And guys, now let's have a look at the photos. Of course, FX30 is not a photo camera, it has only an electronic shutter and only a single shot mode, but still if you need to take only one picture of a not so fast moving object, you can get pretty decent results, and as you can see guys, the difference in the resolution is not huge. The thing that worries me the most with the A7 IV is overheating. In our previous test A7S3 versus A7 III versus A7 IV, we found out that A7 IV has overheating issues even under room temperatures, and if you are planning to shoot a wedding ceremony outdoors under direct sunlight and probably, I don't know, 30 degrees Celsius for 30 to 40 minutes in 4K, this might fail you. And the FX30 has the built-in fan and it will never let you down, so it's another thing to consider. Let's have a brief talk about new functions in the Sony FX30. It has a new fast menu, which is very reliable and convenient, and I do appreciate this menu. It's very easy to use and navigate. Also, it has a new layout, so you can see more of the actual image and less of digital overlays and information. Also, thumbs up for it. There is a Cine AI mode for better workflow with S-Log3, but still guys, remember that Cine AI is not doing magic. It's the same S-Log3 as Gamma 3 Cine or as Gamma 3, the regular one. If you set it in a regular picture profile or in any Cine AI mode, it will have the exact same image if you shoot on the base ISOs of 800 and 2500. One more awesome feature of the FX30 is the variable shutter, so if you have flicker in your shot, you can use this variable shutter function to get rid of it. Also, it has a focus map feature and the focus breathing compensation as well as in the Sony A7 IV. And both cameras have streaming capabilities directly up to 1080p 60 frames per second or 4K 15 frames per second. The memory card slots are also different in those two cameras. A7 IV has the second slot only for SD cards and it's much slower, but for video shooting it's not that important. But I still do prefer the FX30's card slots when it has exactly the same SD plus CF Express Type A cards on both slots. Also guys, I've used Sony FS7 for about 3 years as my main camera, and I gotta say guys that in terms of image quality, dynamic range and low light performance, FX30 is basically either the same or even better in some ways than the FS7. Like 4K 120 recording, FS7 had only 4K 60 and 1080p up to 180 frames per second, which makes me smile because I love compact, affordable yet powerful gear, and Sony FX30 is a perfect example of that. The price difference is $700 if you buy an FX30 without a top handle, and now it's time to decide which camera is a better deal in different circumstances. First case, Sony FX30 is a perfect B camera for FX3, FX6 or even FX9 because of its very similar functions, color science, reliable autofocus, good dynamic range and sharp image. And don't forget about 10-bit if we compare it to, for instance, Sony A7C. Second case, A7 IV is a great photo camera, so if you plan on shooting stills at least 20 to 30% of your working time, I would go for A7 IV. Third case, if you have 0 lenses in your kit and you're tight on a budget, FX30 is an obvious winner. Because not only you're saving $700, but also APS-C lenses are usually more affordable and you can get a good set of AF lenses for under $1,000 easily. My friend Michael, who was in the shot throughout the entire video, bought his FX30 for that exact reason. Fourth case, if you shoot a lot in low light, but the budget is too tight for an A7S III or an FX3. As we saw from the video, A7 IV has very good low light performance, so this might be a game changer for some videographers. Fifth case, if you plan on making a long form content like weddings or interviews in 4K, FX30 will be a better choice because of its active cooling system and it won't let you down even under the sun of Florida. But I'm not too confident in A7 IV in this term. And the last case for today is rolling shutter performance. I would say they are more or less the same in this term, but if you want the best rolling shutter performance, save up some cash and get a used A7S III or FX3. To conclude, I'm more than impressed with the FX30. It's a very capable camera and if you know its limits, you'll be able to get outstanding shots with it. As always, I do recommend renting this camera for a couple of days and trying it out yourself, but I'm gonna tell you that I'm already saving up some money to get an FX30 as my B camera for Sony A7S III. So which camera between those two would you pick for video shooting and why? Let me know down in the comment section below. If you did enjoy this video, please smash the like and subscribe buttons and the notifications bell. My name is Oleg Nikitin and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care, bye.